Hey, and welcome back to Workshop Wednesday. I'm Chelsea Bussemeyer. Thanks so much for joining me today in my workshop. And today we are covering the topic of puckering seams on bias cut garments. Now, if you have never sewn a bias cut garment, I highly encourage you to try it just because they are amazing. They drape beautifully, they're comfortable to wear, and they're just a lot of fun. There are, however, a few basic pitfalls, or not so basic, that are super easy to fall into if you don't know any better and if you've never sewn bias. And if you have, you might have fallen into them already, and that's why you're watching this, to figure out how to solve the puckering seam, a problem that is super common to bias cut garments. So before we get started, I'm just going to introduce our project, and I am super excited for it for a whole bunch of reasons. Number one, 'tis the season and I'm making our Christmas family pajama pants. And yes, I'm making them bias cut, and this is an experiment and an adventure, which is another reason why I'm so excited about this episode and excited for this project to see how it comes together. Now, I loved our jammies last year, and I have a whole tutorial video on how I made them and the steps for making them, so you can look that up if you're interested. Otherwise, let's move on to today's project. Now, this fabric is, or this is the fabric we're using today, and I had to really shop for a flannel that would look nice on the bias, so diagonal. Tilted on that 45-degree angle, because we are cutting our pieces not in grain, but rather in the cross grain. So they need to go along the cross grain. And I love this flannel because it has just this cool texture to it, being that the threads are multicolor. So it's really the threads in the fabric themselves that are the different colors. So the right and the left actually look pretty similar. And I'm also getting a little more experimental with this piece because I'm flipping the fabric around, and I'm going to do the right side on the inside simply due to the fact that it's softer. So why would I not want that towards my skin? But also because the smooth side will be on the outside, and you can see this textured thread mix of the colors better, and it just is a nice smooth finish. So it's kind of the best of both worlds. Usually the flannel, because it's brushed kind of like a suede after it's woven to give it that fuzzy feel, that's usually the top side. And if it's a printed color or they've dyed the fabric after the fact, then your right side is going to be a lot more vibrant and you can't just switch them around. But that is not the case with this one. So yeah, it's a pretty cool fabric and I'm excited to use it. And life hack here, there's a tag on this fabric because this is actually a top sheet. So I got myself new flannel bed sheets simply because I wanted the top sheet for our PJ pants. So that's a win-win there too. So let's look at this project, how it's coming together, and the most common pitfalls that you will fall into when sewing bias cut garments. So I've started piecing together the first pair, and you can see I've closed the side seam on the pants, and I've also installed the first pocket on this side. And what I love about this fabric is it really shows you how the threads are running in the garment so that you can understand how a bias cut garment really works. So the first thing you're going to want to do is when you're cutting out your bias cut garment, so right at the beginning, you really want to make sure that the threads are running square. Because this flannel is not as slippery as other fabrics you might want to use for a bias cut garment, if you're doing a really flowy skirt or something like that, the threads will automatically stay more square in the weave. If you are using something that's flowy, then check and double check that your fabric is smooth when you're cutting it out and that the threads are really square to themselves. If you're going to torque in the piece when you're cutting it out, then it will often cause puckering along the seam. One way to identify if the puckering is from the piece being cut out torqued rather than square in the bias is it will just be on that piece. So if you've got puckers on one side of your seam and not on the other, that could be a key. or if it's really going from the puckers along the seam and causing real drag lines in your garment, that could also be a sign for your pieces not being cut square when you're cutting them out. The next thing that can cause puckers on your seams is when we're cutting bias cut garments, the curves and contours of the pieces will be different depending on what part of the body it's supposed to cover. So if we have, more of a curve on a hip, on the back of the hip rather than on the front piece, then that is a prime spot for the puckers to also occur. So number one, make sure your pieces are cut square when you go to cut them. A quick little tip for helping you kind of square off your material when it's folded to cut on the bias. You can see here, it's folded into a point so that we have exactly that 45-degree angle running through the fabric here on the fold line. So this is where you would place any kind of a pattern piece that needs to be cut on the fold. And when we stretch it, you can see it really has some nice give to it. However, to square it off, just tug your fabric right along the thread so that they're nice and straight this way and nice and straight this way. That can help kind of just square the threads off to each other so that they're running straight through the pieces and you don't have a torque. Number two, when you have a seam that's puckering on both sides, then it's most likely due to the fact that the garment is getting overstretched. So that bias cut garment is going to have some nice stretch to it or movement to it so that it can sculpt and shape to your body. However, if you overstretch it, and I'm just going to give it a little bit of a tug here, you can see that my seam starts to pucker. And this will pucker evenly on both sides. You can also see that we're losing length kind of when we stretch it. So due to the fact that the threads themselves, the fabric itself isn't expanding to stretch with the bias cut, we kind of have to borrow from Peter to pay Paul. So if we're adding width to our garment, we're losing length. Those threads are just scissoring in the fabric. And when they shorten up, when they get closer together, lay flatter to stretch around your hips, the stitch line length is getting shorter as well. However, our stitch or our thread itself is the original length. So it needs to go somewhere and it ends up going up and down and puckering. So we really want to balance our garments when we're sewing bias cut in that we want to cut them square and then stitch them square. So you really want to make sure that you're not stretching one piece or the other piece when you're piecing them together, that you're not bunching them up under the sewing machine or stretching them out because you can get that extra length even without the garment being too tight if you've kind of stretched it along the seam as you've stitched it together, and then when the fabric relaxes to its original state, that seam line length that you've added in extra needs to go somewhere and will pucker. So you really want to work square and make sure that you're not stretching or easing your seam allowances together. On the flip side of that, once you get more confident with your sewing and diagnosing what the issue is, you can play with that a little bit. Sometimes, for example, when I've altered pre-existing garments that were bias cut and too small for the body and they were puckering really bad, I would kind of press it with the iron and ease that fabric together, or even while stitching it, shove it through a little quicker than my pressure foot was feeding it so that it would be shortened and give us some extra volume. But that is a more advanced technique, and when we're sewing a garment from the get-go, we want it to be correct, and that is having the fullness that we need for the body so that we only need the stretch for movement and not actually for getting in and out or fitting over our body itself, because that will automatically give us straighter and smoother seams. The third and final reason why your seam might be puckering is due simply to the curve and contour of the pieces that you are adjoining. And in this scenario, it's great to kind of go back to your original pattern pieces, see what kind of shapes and edges you're working with and where exactly the grain line kind of goes into them. If you're working with a piece, say a princess seam, where you have a very curved edge on your side panel and a straighter edge on the front middle, you're going through a very full range of grain line, and being that the pieces don't match up, aren't symmetrical, aren't cut through the same range of grain line, sometimes you'll need to distribute the fullness a little bit different. If when you've closed the seam you find that you have puckers on one side but not on the other, try opening it up and distributing the length of that piece right along that seam line a little bit differently. You may even find you need to shove a little bit of length out on the side that's puckering. So that puckering is once again just extra length, and sometimes when a garment is bias cut, that stitch line length will just drape out, hang out, and ideally we want to match up those stitch lines. We want to distribute the length of the fabric because the pattern pieces have been designed to match up. Those stitch line lengths do match, but due to the fact that the fabric is so moldable in the bias cut state, you might need to just let it hang out, let that front panel drop down a little bit longer, just for the simple fact that you get a nice smooth edge rather than lining up your panels but having those puckers still remain. So working with bias cut does require a little bit more sculpting or molding of the fabric, and definitely don't let it scare you though, because they are just simply beautiful garments, hang and drape beautifully, and I am so excited for these PJs because I know they're going to be even more comfortable than my last pair, and they are honestly my favorite PJs ever. So that wraps up this episode of Workshop Wednesday. I'm super excited to see this project come together. If you want to see it, make sure you get on my email list before I send these PJs out as my Me Made Monday. I always do an email with a write-up and give you some nice helpful tips for sewing, often on Mondays, and I like to feature finished projects that I've made. So pop down to the description box, sign up for that so you don't miss it, and until next week, take care and happy sewing.